And so the wilderness seems to be like a very unusual place. It's a place that God uses. As we think about the wilderness, it's a place of limitations. It's a place where they don't have everything that they might need. And we are very limited in what we have available to us. And so there might be limited water. There might be too much heat. We live in a desert, and at times we've shown places out in the desert where there is no water anywhere around. As you think about the limitations, there might be limited food, there might be limitations on water. Why would you have a place where limitations exist? Wouldn't we go for the place where there is enough and plenty of everything? And yet, at the same time, we realize that when we see children who grow up who have absolutely everything that they want, everything they could ever wish for, it doesn't turn out well. They don't turn out to be great people who have everything and are so kind and so generous. They tend to turn out a little bit spoiled, and that's not always good. They are more selfish, they are more demanding. And so to give a person everything they ever want is not going to be good for them. If you think about that, then that's where wilderness comes in. There might be a place where it is very, very useful because of the limitations that it has, because we need limitations. And so as children grow up, they need parents to be able to give them limitations and say, well, you can have this, but not too much. And so it might be good to be able to give them a bowl of ice cream, but they can't eat 3 cartons of ice cream all at once. They can't exist on just a diet of candy, even though that's probably what they would prefer. It would be the choice that they would make, but it really isn't good for them. Parents should, give them something better than just letting them do anything they want, stay up as late as they want, do anything they want, go anywhere they want. Parents need to guide and to help them to understand exactly what is needed to be able to live and to grow up and to do well. And so when we think about that and we think about the things that God does with his people, the Bible tells us about Israel as he leads them out of Egypt. First of all, they come to a place where there's a barrier, and he leads them exactly to the point where there is a barrier. It's called the Red Sea. And they can't do anything to get across. The Egyptian army is chasing them. They realize that it's impossible, and they need God. And so it's the first time where they have to depend on God. Actually, they just panic. But God shows them that they should depend on him because that's what makes all the difference in the long run. We find that they're able to, through Moses, to part the Red Sea. They're able to walk across on dry ground. And we see that people were brought through purposefully by God through this dangerous place, this dangerous situation, and now they are able to go in and go toward what God calls a promised land. It's a land where he had promised to take them. It's a good land. He refers to it as a land flowing with milk and honey. And so it's going to be this great, beautiful place. He does not take them the shortest way. In fact, it says he does that on purpose because the shortest way involved the Philistines. And as they would go through the land of the Philistines, even though they weren't trying to capture it, and even though they wouldn't try to stay there, still it would mean war. And God does not want them discouraged from war. And so he brings them out, rather, into the wilderness. Exactly, into a place where there is limitation. And so he doesn't give them absolutely everything. He gives them a place where they must depend on him and where they have limitation. Yeah, it's like he's trying to raise children because he wants them to depend on him. Well, the first thing that happens is they run out of water. And yet Moses is able to bring them through to a place that does have water, but the water's bad. And so now what are they supposed to do? They grumble about there's no water. You brought us out here to kill us. What are you trying to do to us? We would have been better off in Egypt. And so the people complain. God talks to Moses. He tells them to take basically a log and throw it into the water and it'll become sweet. And that does. And so that solves it temporarily.
Exodus 16. They set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they departed from the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger.
The people run out of food. And as they're eating whatever they brought for the third day, the fourth day, the fifth day, you know how it is after a couple of weeks when you've had leftovers after leftovers. I'm sure you guys never have that. But you can get tired of the food that you have, and you can just run completely out of food so that there just isn't any. And they come to a place where they start remembering what it was like in Egypt, and they're saying, you brought us out here to kill us. We're going to die in the wilderness. Why did you bring us out here? Because didn't we have it much better off when we were in Egypt? Because in Egypt, we had all kinds of fish from the Nile. We had meat pots. We had lots of things to eat. And it appears as if it might be the first time they've experienced hunger. While conditions were horrible in Egypt because of the cruelty of the Egyptians, making them slaves, killing their babies, beating them, and forcing them into labor, we see that they probably ate fairly well. And so it may be the first time that they've been without food. And they begin to complain about this. We don't have any food. What are we going to eat out here? There isn't anything. You brought us out here to kill us.
Exodus 16:4. Then the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you. And the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily. So Moses and Aaron said to the people of Israel, At evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against the Lord. For what are we, that you grumble against us? And Moses said, When the Lord gives you in the evening meat to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, because the Lord has heard your grumbling, and you grumble against him, what are we? Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord.
Moses talks to God. God is going to provide for them. And so basically, God says to Moses, I'm going to rain bread from heaven. Well, that sounds good, especially if you're starving. And by the time you get this hungry, anything sounds good. And so he says, I'm going to do this so that they will learn to depend on me, so that they will learn I am the God who provides. Well, it's really hard to know that God provides when you're sitting at the banquet table and there's every kind of food available and you don't need anything. You see, in order to understand that God provides, there first has to be a need. The wilderness is the place to find need because of the limitations that wilderness has. And so if there isn't a need, God can't show that he's provider, and so he lets them run out of food in order that they might realize we have a need. We cannot do this on our own. We need to depend on God. And so before they have faith, before they believe in God completely, he says, I'm going to rain bread from heaven. And so that's what God does. He gives them instruction, but he says, I'm going to do this so that I can see whether or not you will follow my commandments. He says, I want you to gather a certain amount, an omer, for each person for each day. Only that much. Don't gather too much. Just get what you need for that day. And you will be able to get it every single day. But you can't get today a freezer full. You have to be able to get it every single day. And so there's a limitation on that. They can't store it up and say, okay, I've got enough now. The last day of the week, I want you to be able to take enough for 2 days. And so you're not going to gather any food on the Sabbath. So on Friday you would gather enough for 2 days. On the Sabbath there won't be any. It's not complicated. It's pretty simple. And so what you see happening is the people not believe God. In fact, they gather way too much. And he says, eat it all. Don't save it over. And they do. They try and save it over and they try and keep it. And what happens is, well, it begins to stink and it begins to make worms and it isn't good anymore. And so what you have happening is it spoils. Well, it's because they didn't follow the directions. The same thing happens as they get to Friday. They should have enough for 2 days. Some people still go out on Sabbath day. God told them there wasn't going to be anything there. He told them to gather enough for 2 days. And it takes a while before the people ever get this idea that, yes, I can depend on God. Yes, I can depend on Him every single day because there will be just enough for that day. And that's all you need. You don't need enough for the next year. It's not like toilet paper. I mean, that went crazy with this pandemic. And so it isn't like we save it all up and hoard it all up and now we've got enough and we don't have to worry. That's exactly what God's trying to avoid. He's trying to show you need just what you need and I will provide it. And so God is the provider. And that's what he's trying to show people in this wilderness. Well, the wilderness creates the need, and then there's a God who is able to be there in this wilderness, who is able to provide for his people. Because after all, it's not a place where they're going to be forever. They're passing through to a promised land, to a place that is going to be better. And so how do you pray? Do we pray for God to give us what we want? And if it doesn't come immediately, what happens to then? What happens to us? Do then we believe that, well, God just isn't caring about us? Or do we believe that we should wait for God's timing? Because God knows what we need and he will give us what we need when it's time. And we don't need anything without God being involved. It's the lesson God was trying to teach Israel, that they would depend on him to know the right time to give them what they need, that they would never do without, that he would protect them, that he would guide them. It's what every parent tries to teach a child. You can always depend on me. I will always be there. Do you get it every single time you ask? Every single time you demand? No, because it isn't always good for you. And so there is this learning curve of learning to depend on somebody else who knows better. We always get hungriest right before dinner, right? And you've always heard the thing, well, don't eat that, it'll spoil your dinner. We would rather spoil our dinner. It's what we want. But the parents know that's not good for you. And so they'll say no. And sometimes God says no, because it's not what's best for us right then, even if it's something absolutely essential that we are going to need. It isn't what's best for us right then. We need to learn to depend on God, because God is the one who provides. It's one of those most difficult lessons in faith, to do without and still believe there's a God who will provide when you don't have what you need.
Exodus 17. And the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of Sin by stages according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" And the people thirsted there for water. And the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us, and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried to the Lord, "What shall I do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me."
Well, they come to a time where they have no water. Water is a real need. You do not survive long without water. And so you have to have water in order to do anything. And God has led them to a desert, to a wilderness, to a place where there is no water. And so the people begin to complain there isn't any water. Would you blame them? I mean, isn't that logical to say if there is no water, you've got a lot of people out here and it looks like you brought us out here to kill us? It's very easy for them then to blame God as if God is not providing. You have to be able to realize God provides. But until you've been thirsty, would you know that you can depend on God to provide? If you always have water, you're never going to know or have to even answer that question.
Exodus 17:5. And the Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?"
And so that brings up an interesting thing. God calls it a test. And he says it's a test to see if you'll really believe that I am the one who provides. At the same time, the people are putting God to the test. And they want to turn it all around and say, the focus is really on us. It's not about you. The focus is on us and whether or not you're going to provide for us. And so it's a test about you, God. And we're here in a wilderness and we don't have any water. And if you don't give us some water, wait a second, it's all gotten backwards. And when we focus on us and think it's all about us, that's when everything gets distorted. We decide, God, we're not going to believe in you if you don't give us what we need, if you don't satisfy our every need. And there is a need for water. Absolutely, there's a need for water. And so it turns completely around because the people decide, we don't believe in God unless God gives us water. Well, God says, okay, I'm going to give them all the water they can handle. And so he gives them a tremendous amount of water, but he does it by standing on the rock before them. Moses comes up, he tells Moses to strike the rock, and as Moses strikes the rock, the water comes out. And it is immediately, instantly enough water for a nation. How does that happen? How do you get that much water in a desert? That much water in a dry place? Well, the answer is that God provides, and that God is constantly doing this, that God is always providing, and that's what he wants them to learn, and that's what he wants them to always know. Is there going to be a time when you get thirsty? Wouldn't there need to be in order to believe and know that God provides? And yet we want to turn that around and say, I'll believe in a God when I never want for anything. That's not the way wilderness works. It's not the children who demand from the parents what they have to have. It's the parents who train the children. Faith is believing beyond the circumstance. And so in our prayer life, do we tend to force God? Do we pray prayers of force. God, you need to give me this. God, we demand our rights. We demand our provisions. We demand everything. I'm not sure God wants to be addressed that way. After all, He's the one who knows best for us. And sometimes our prayers take on more the tone that we are the ones who are demanding, that we are the ones who are controlling God, more than God being the ones who is a great giver and a loving God who is able to provide everything we need at the right time without spoiling His children. It is not taking us out of the wilderness. That would be our normal prayer. God, please take away any limitations that we have. Please take away anything of injustice that we would have. Please take away any discomfort that we would have. Make us be in a place that's wonderful and great, and we have everything that we possibly need. God sends us to the wilderness on purpose. It is for us to learn. It will not be forever. But it is what God is trying to show us and what God is trying to teach us. We do not get out of the wilderness without learning what God wants us to learn. As you watch the children of Israel go through this wilderness, it is a very difficult time for them. They tend not to depend on God because God isn't giving them, and they're like spoiled children who are demanding. Well, until you come to the understanding that the parent is going to provide for you, we generally don't know and we don't accept, and we feel like someone is not caring or loving. It has to start with God. And so God gives them several incidences where He's able to help them understand what it's all about. He's able to help them understand, you need me, I will be there, I will provide, and in some huge miraculous ways God provides. And yet the people still don't believe. They get all the way to the edge of the promised land and the people still don't believe. It looks too difficult, we can't go in. And so the people still don't believe. They never come to depend on God. Well, what happens then? The sad fact is they never get out of the wilderness. They stay there. And yeah, that means they die there. We either learn this lesson to depend on God and to go on from there to His blessings, to a promised land, to this wonderful life that God is giving, or we're still throwing the tantrum on the floor as a child, demanding that our God answer us and do exactly for us what we want. It is a very different situation. It is about us learning in the wilderness to depend on God. Jesus is going to use this story later. He actually provides food for people who have been following Him and listening to His teaching. They've been there about 3 days. He's afraid as He would send them away, and so He says to His disciples, you give them something to eat. It turns out that He feeds about 5,000 men plus their families that they brought with them. And so that's a huge thing. It's where God provides. God did something great for them. I don't even know that it was them asking, but they have completely run out of food, and God shows His provision. And the next thing they do is come to Jesus and say, how about lunch? Essentially, is what they're saying. Because it is more about this concept that, well, God provides. Like in the wilderness, God provided for the people, and He gave them manna, bread out of heaven to eat. You gave us some yesterday, bread and fish. And so they're asking for God to once again provide for them.
John 6:28. Then they said to Him, what must we do to be doing the works of God? And Jesus answered them, this is the work of God, that you believe in Him whom He has sent. So they said to Him, then what sign do you do, that we may see and believe you? What work do you perform? The fathers ate manna in the wilderness, as it is written, He gave them bread from heaven to eat. And Jesus then said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, It was not Moses who gave you bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world.
Jesus says the only reason that you're asking is because you want the food, not because you depend on God, not because you've developed this faith or have this great understanding that Jesus was able to feed probably 15 to 20,000 people out of 5 loaves and 2 fish. And they miss the fact that God has this huge miracle for them and is able to do something so fantastic, but they want lunch now. I mean, after all, it's 12:30, and we can't go without lunch. We have to have it, and so they become more and more demanding. And he says, "Well, I'm the Messiah. I'm trying to get you to understand, to believe that I'm the one who provides, and that I am God." Well, their argument is, "Well, then show us a sign. What sign do you show?" And the sign that we suggest is, "Why don't you give us lunch?" And so once again, we're to the same thing of we're not going to believe in a God who doesn't provide for us. God says, "I want you to be in need so that you'll understand I am a God who provides for you." Those are the two sides of the argument. It goes on and on. If we never allow ourselves to be in need, we will never understand a God who provides. If we are always demanding of God in prayer that he answer our every wish, that he answer our everything, and that it is not good for us to ever go without, then we've missed the concept of being able to have faith in God and depend on what God says. We don't appear to God to be people who believe in him when things get hard. So the reason for wilderness is a chance to wait for God's timing, to allow God to provide for us, not for us to get it on our own.